بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر للذنوب إلا أنت. I wanted to talk about the issue of virtue, policing, and capitalism. And this conversation really, it takes place within the context of some processes that have transformed society that need to be talked about. The backdrop of what I wanted to talk about, which is the issue of virtue, policing, and capitalism. The backdrop to that is that we live in a settler colonial state. This is a country that was established on settler colonialism. And in reality, much of the 20th and 21st century is the byproduct of what took place earlier on, going back at least, we're talking at least 500 years now. And that is with the European colonial powers, when they emerged after the fall of Al-Andalus, they were internally going through certain changes, okay? And these changes were changes that were coming about during what the European historians call the Renaissance period. And the Renaissance period was the period in which there was a transition coming from what was called the medieval period, in which the power of the rich and religion was completely dominant on the continent of Europe. And the Renaissance period was a period in which there was an attempt to go back to the roots of what were considered the roots of civilization for Europeans. Like I said, what was considered. And so, because the European society has never been one society, it has always been a society of division and a society of, where there's breakdown. And so the reality of Europe is that it was a tribal reality which emerged into racial states, right? The nation state is a race-based state. In the backdrop, when they were trying to look at Greece and Rome as inspirations after they had taken from the Muslims, they began to transform certain modes of of their thinking. Now remember that Christianity had gained a lot of dominance in Europe, but Christianity is not originally, if you were to use their system of thinking, it's not originally a European phenomenon. It's what they call the Semitic phenomena, right? Christianity in reality is a sect of Judaism that emerged on its own. It began to develop its own identity and so on and so forth. And it took that direction. And so it took the direction of independence. And so the issue of the Renaissance, why it's important, is because the Renaissance began to introduce ideas into the continent of Europe that forced thought about how to do things, right? So science was not something that was new because at this point, because it was already something that was understood from the Muslims, right? The Muslim, people like Francis Bacon and others, they were, already had some understanding of what the Muslims were doing. And, there were people before Bacon, when you go back to Aquinas, who was studying from Ibn Rushd, they saw what the Muslims were doing. The Muslims were, holding on to the reality of civilization. The Muslims were built, and what I mean by civilization here is I'm talking about material civilization. But there was no transformation in Europe to make it anti-religious. Europe still was trying to dialogue with religion, but what happened was that the church made big mistakes, the Catholic Church specifically. The Catholic Church began to control the people to such an extent and in such a manner that what was being encountered in knowledge contradicted what was being taught by the church. And eventually thinkers, they began to, there's a lot of connections that need to be made. Thinkers began to work through things. Modernity, what people don't really realize, what modernity, if we talk about people like Descartes as a father of modernity. Some people say that he had taken Ghazali's Deliverance from Error, Munqadh min al-Dalala, his biography, and kind of flipped it and tried to go into his own journey of thinking. And that opened the door to focus on reason. And Descartes in the Cartesian experiment, in the Cartesian thought experiment, had eliminated everything. The world, you're not influenced by the society, you're not influenced by your emotions, you're not influenced by religion, nothing. In his thought experience, he did leave this evil genius, which I call the jinn, which he allowed him to continuously influence him in his thought experiment. But Descartes had doubted in himself physically. He doubted in God. He doubted in his own existence. So modernity begins with this doubting of everything as a thought experiment. And it begins with conquering other people by force and the sword, by negating them their humanity. And as these clashes were taking place within the continent of Europe and various European societies with religion, and there were successes that were made with material science and by thinking through problems, this led more and more for European civilization to go up against religion. And so with time, and this is the problem that I have with Muslims imitating the non-Muslims in this regard, of the Christians, is that, the history of reason in the Muslim community is not the history of reason in Europe. You understand what I'm saying? Like, Muslims in many ways are imitating the Christian trajectory of how Christianity deals with issues. And they're getting themselves in problems, right, of how they solve issues. You don't solve issues by just talking about, well, you need to be a good person and that's it. Some issue, this is the issue that we have, like, there's some things that have core causes. That's why we have science. That's why we have psychology. That doesn't mean that psychology and science is separate from belief or from Iman. But the point being is that Islamic civilization has never just talked about problems of the human being and of the society solely by just saying, well, the problem is that there's a breakdown in people's morality. You know what I'm saying? That's the issue. Just be a good Christian and everything will resolve itself. That is how Muslims are beginning to think. Well, just be a good Muslim and everything will resolve itself. And so the issue when we start talking about the secularization of society, we're talking about a breakdown that has taken place in Western civilization itself, people. You understand what I'm saying? So Muslims are coming into this reality. Muslims have lost political power just within the last 100 years. And it has created a major crisis for the Muslim community. But the history of Western society, the imposition of these settler states in different places, this has led to a major breakdown for a good many people. And so when we look at right now where capitalism is at, capitalism is about wealth extraction, people. It has become the new religion of the age, people. And so I'm trying to simplify things that, need time to understand. It's not that easy for me to do that. And the reality of this situation is that with the breakdown of society and community, what has really arisen within the capitalist system is individualism. And that supports the marketplace, people. And what has been the end result for European society, which in many ways has rejected religion, or if there's religion, it has tried to restrict religion. We don't have a common religious background, people, in this society. You understand what I'm saying? We don't even have a common set of values that we're all sharing, because it's constantly flipping and changing. That's part of where the marketplace is at and what the marketplace does. So if the marketplace feels as though selling killing one day, it sells in movies and is reflective of life, they'll sell it. They don't care if it's a violation of human dignity. And if the law doesn't come in and restrict it, it goes. That's why one moment alcohol is prohibited, the next moment is allowed. You know what I'm saying? The same thing with marijuana. It flips. Although that's not to say that, for instance, we're not leave aside the medical usage issue, but we're just talking about how it is that morality in this society changes. And I'm not even talking about whether I agree or don't agree. I'm just talking about that process that has to be understood. Morality in this society flips. It can flip on at any moment because there's no reference point for it. And so you have to understand that there's a breakdown in this society. And so what virtue is, of course, human reason has the capacity to determine to some extent, not in totality in our belief as Muslims, but it has the ability to do a pretty good job at determining some things that are right and wrong. But it can't be the only source of understanding what's right and wrong. Right? And so what that leaves the people with is no common ground to determine what's right and wrong. And so there's a fight with individualism and with this whole concept of different moralities and different ethics. It's a fight to determine what's right and wrong. You understand what I'm saying? And so what happens is at the end of the day, because you have a capitalist system, there's benefit when there's breakdown. The capitalist mindset is, how can we benefit off of any situation? Whether it's criminality, you understand what I'm saying? Whether it's forgetfulness, whether it's bad health, how can we benefit from it? So the breakdown in the understanding on certain levels. Look, when you're in suburban societies, they know for sure that there have to be certain things in place. You have to have employment. You have to have educational institutions. You have to have, there has to be some organization of the community in such a way that there's mental health. They invest in that. And so in many of these places where you see less crime, it's because the society itself is playing a game on us. You understand what I'm saying? These things are scientifically understood. It's not, there's minimal crime, not because the people are more virtuous. There's minimal crime because the people have their basic needs in a capitalist system met. They have housing needs met. They can go to the car dealer and they can decide, well, I want to get this car, not that car. I have health insurance. My kids are going to a good school. That's why they move with less policing, people. But the idea of, that doesn't mean that there's no problems. You understand what I'm saying? But the idea of criminality is lessened. And so what we see with the idea of policing people, it comes because there's a breakdown in society delivering in what it needs to be delivering on. There's tons of studies on this stuff. We live in a very scientific, socially scientifically controlled society, Morality changes scientifically. It changes with changes in science. It changes with changes in culture. That's how it is. Because there's no set reference point, people. The human being and the individual is the determinant of what is right or wrong. That's the source of knowledge for them. And so, people, that being the case, we have to be careful of how, when we do da'wah, we have to be careful that we don't confuse issues. We have to make sure that we understand where people are coming from, what it is that's happening. We have a reference point as Muslims. So, the reference point for every Muslim is the book and the Sunnah. And so then, when we start talking about the scholarship of the Muslims, it's an attempt to clarify the meanings of the book and the Sunnah and apply them to life. But it's a cop-out to not talk about what has happened in Europe. It's a cop-out to not talk about where the Muslims are and where the Muslims fit in this context. It's a cop-out not to really have an understanding of knowledge and how it works in society, the role of reason, the role of revelation, the role of experience. If you don't understand these things, then you can't even enter into these discussions in a scholarly way. You can enter into them in another way. You may have some understanding and insight. But if we're going to talk about scholarship and being imams and mashaykhs and so on and so forth, or mashayikh, this reality, you can't come into this reality just dictating who's right and wrong and who's good and who's not good without educating the people on how it is that these things have occurred. There's a definite transformation of the definition of a human being in this society. It has been the case since the inception of the European colonial powers, right? And so what you see now with the changing of identity, even biological identity, even the assignation of gender and all of this, these are transformations in the definition of the human being. And they have been there for a while. We're talking, and see, the part of the problem where people don't understand is that at the same time that you have that type of discussion going on, there still hasn't been a resolution on who's a full human being. We live in a tiered legal system that doesn't consider everybody equal as far as the law is concerned. So there's a law for blacks. There's a law for illegal immigrants, right? There's a law for indigenous people. There's legal codes that operate. Everybody is not a full citizen. Everybody's not operating out of full citizenship. And that comes back to the definition of the way the system understands who is a human being. For goodness sake, we live in a society where a corporation is now determined to be a citizen, a human being. So those people who are talking, they don't understand the anthropology. And I'm not talking about anthropology as a discipline studied in the university. I'm talking about the study of the human being, the anthropos. Anthropos is the human. Logi is the study of the human. We have to understand that we're not the ones that are defining who a human being is right now. And it's not only here, like when you look at the global system, people, when you look at the global system and you understand the structure of the global system, it's set up in a tiered system. So-called first world and third world and all of the developing countries and this and that. That language, where does it come from? The idea of race, where does it come from? Right? Even how sex is understood, where does it come from? So Muslims are not even in the discourse. You understand what I'm saying? Muslims are lashing out at a reality that is a reality, yes, that we're in, but they're lashing out at a reality that they themselves don't even know how to articulate how to deal with the reality. And so when it comes to the issue of policing people, the reason why it comes in at the level that it comes in is because it benefits the system economically. It's not because the system is interested in bringing about virtue or bettering the conditions. Because if they were interested in bettering the conditions, they would create viable communities. They would invest in communities, right? And then the issue comes up, what kind of community do we want to see? And then that is where we have a dialogue and a debate on the issue of what community do we want to see. Because that community, in a society in which you have different religious orientations and different intellectual and philosophical orientations to life, now the problem of the contemporary governmental system is how do you navigate that? Because it can't be a situation in this system where one group dominates over the other to oppress the other. And that's why you find that there's fights in the system. That's why you have people yelling out oppression, because they're trying to compete for some sort of dignity. Forget about whether you agree with them or not. You understand what I'm saying? You have to understand the processes that are at work here in this system. That as individuals that may come together in a group, everyone is competing for what they say is their rights. That's the nature of the society. We're not talking about how Islam understands it. We're talking about understanding the society as it is. Then we could talk about our position as Muslims. Because where our position as Muslims lands is that we're in a position where we're trying to create space. We're trying to liberate space for ourselves. That's why you find Muslims getting involved in these political interactions that they get in, because they're not understanding completely how to liberate space, but they're making an effort to liberate space. The problem that we have right now is that intellectually, we don't have a response that is coming from groundedness and rootedness versus reaction. You understand what I'm saying? We're not understanding how to respond in a way that it gives us strength. We're being reactionary towards what's going on. And I mentioned this over and over again. When you mention some of these situations and scenarios, Muslims are fretting over situations that in reality there's not much that they can say, because they've been absent for the majority of the time that they have been here from the public discourse. Where are the public intellectuals that represent the Muslim community? Who are the intellectual figures that can have a response? No, the Muslims end up following, non-Muslim figures like Jordan Peterson or whatever. That's what the Muslims are doing. And before they were doing other things. And it's not like they dialogue with Jordan Peterson and say, we agree with you on this, we disagree on this. No, they follow blindly. Muqallidun. You understand what I'm saying? And so you find even many people posing themselves as Mashaykh and Imams that they're not trained as Mashaykh and Imams. They're not trained as Mashaykh and Imams. And then if they're trained as Mashaykh and Imams, the question is, are they at the level where they can properly articulate? Because we don't need anybody just throwing out ideas. We need people that are really grounded intellectually and socially to be able to create a feedback loop between themselves, the Muslim community, and the society, and where we can begin to articulate a position or a set of positions that can be positions in progress. That we're continually modifying them, but it's happening, organically, so to speak, which is not 100% bad, but there's mistakes. And so we have to understand. So I talked about official legal policing, but also you can't police virtue, people. You understand what I'm saying? Islam doesn't police virtue. Islam cultivates virtue. And then what it polices is violations that are problematic to the common good. You can't police virtue, people. You understand what I'm saying? And you can't force non-Muslims to have the same moral system as you people. That's the dilemma that you have. La ikraha fi din. You know what I'm saying? The issue of hal al-kuffar mukhatabun bi furu' al-sharia. That's an issue in usul al-fiqh. All the non-Muslims are obligated to follow the branches in Sharia. If they're not following in the usul, if they're not following in Aqidah, then why should they follow in the branches? Come on. And then even if you go with the minority opinion, which says that they are, you don't have a way of, qadiyat al-tanfeed, a way of enforcing that. And then if you enforce that, you have to make sure that you're not violating the principle of the Quran, la ikrah fi din, which means that now you have to go into a social contract. And we don't have a political system that we're participating in where we have developed a social contract for that issue. You see what I'm saying? And those are issues which non-Muslim countries are more in a position to deal with than we are. We're trying to figure out how it is that we can engage the social contract. And we add, because this is not just a social contract, there's also a racial contract in this country. These things are studied. This is not just something that is coming out of hollow intellectualism. You understand what I'm saying? And so we ourselves, I'll be straight up with you. A lot of the people that are talking shouldn't be talking. Because what they're doing is communicating emotivism. Their philosophy and orientation is one of emotions. It's not one of bringing principled solutions to the situation. How long are we going to keep talking about the whole LGBT community, people? Just because it's the month? How many times y'all going to talk about that? It's sealed. It's in the books. You don't have to talk about the issue. What you have to do is make sure that you're dealing with the Muslims that are suicidal and the Muslims that are suffering clinical depression. But unfortunately, we have a bunch of brothers that's what the hot topic is on. But at the same time, the hot topic for them is not dealing with organizing the Muslim community to better address the Palestinian situation. Or it's not about organizing the community to deal with the fact that we just had 4 Muslims lynched, or a family lynched with 1 survivor in Canada. This is where, again, because these are issues that pertain to our existence in this society. We don't have the ideological intellectual leadership. People are playing games. We're being shortchanged. And so, virtue, people, on the first account, if we want to talk about Talim and Tarbiyah, we want to talk about education and formation on the intellectual and spiritual level and so on and so forth, in our character level, virtue has to, you have to come into that freely, people. You have to come into the Shahada freely, people. And then when you come into the Shahada, you have to understand, and I'm talking about from the Muslim orientation, because by the way, the Quran is a multi-tiered discourse. It is a discourse, it's a divine speech which speaks to multiple groups. It's not just speaking to the Muslims. It's speaking to the non-Muslims. It's speaking to the munafiqun. It's speaking to those who are enemies to Islam. It's speaking to those who may be favorable. It's speaking to the weak Muslim, the strong Muslim. The Quran is dynamic in that regard. And the Quran is not just addressing the situation of the human being, but the Quran is also talking to us about the reality of the creation itself, the environment as a whole, how we should understand it. Because it's the creation of Allah. So in the Quranic orientation, the way that it first came down, people have to come in, they have to be committed to the deen. They have to come into an understanding. There has to be a connection. And so the Quran is addressing the intellect and is addressing the heart and emotion. But at the same time, the Quran didn't just send a message, the Quran sent a messenger. And so that messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, embodies certain principles in the society. He was known prior to revelation. And then at the same time put a responsibility on the individual, which is the taklif and nubuwah, the responsibility of prophethood. But the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as a prophet being selected, and he's Mustafa, he was selected by Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, alayhi salatu wasalam. He had a certain relationship with people. Like, we don't have a relationship with people. Our masajid don't have a relationship with people. Our imams and our mashayikh don't have a relationship with people. The so-called talking heads for Islam don't have a relationship with people. And the reason why we say that is because the louder they get, the more dehumanizing they are. And we see they don't have a relationship with people. They're focusing on virtue, rules, this, that. But they're not dealing with the human being behind the situation. And they think that showing compassion, when Allah Ta'ala is demonstrated as Rahmatan lil Alameen, they think that that is against the issue of the deen. And they're not addressing the human being on multiple levels. You're addressing the human being from the angle of do, don't do, but you don't know why it is that the human being is involved in a situation of the haram or the prohibited. And we have been guided in that regard by the example of the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wasalam. When Aisha herself was asked what was the first thing to be revealed of the Quran, it was the Muslim community that responded to her. Because the first of the thing to be revealed of the Quran with regard to revelation wasn't prohibition of alcohol. It wasn't prohibition of a fornication and adultery, sex acts. In other words, sex acts were not the first thing to be prohibited, people. Neither was the issue of getting high, including the issue, and we're applying it to today's time, including the issue of the prohibition of alcohol. If we look at that as a study, is any sort of intoxicant. So the first thing to be addressed was not that you smoke weed. It wasn't that you get high, that you do this kind of drugs, that you pop these kind of pills. That wasn't the first address. But the first thing to be addressed was just presenting who Allah is in a way which responded to the people. And the people responded back to Aisha when she was asked that question, what was the first thing to be revealed? That if you would have enforced that prohibition of alcohol, prohibition of fornication and adultery, that we would have rebelled against that. So let's take lessons from the Sahaba themselves. Who are we? Who are we? You understand what I'm saying? What sacrifice have we made for the deen? People have their own personal sacrifices. But that generation is a generation which came out of trash. It came out of thuggery. It came out of using intoxicants. It came out of brokenness in family. It came out of relationships which are all complicated and messed up. People didn't even know who their fathers were. It came out of a situation of exploitation, dehumanization. And so we should study that to understand how it is that the deen transformed it. And so that example that I just gave you is one in which you see that the Sahaba themselves are admitting what was the process that change took place. And who's following that process? Because the human condition stays the same. There's the other example that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the early phases of the da'wah, people would come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the reality of the situation was that they would tell them that they committed adultery. And he would just try to push them away, but they kept insisting. And so then he would try to address that. And all the way up to in the beginning phase of Medina, the Muslims were going to Salah intoxicated. Come on now. There was a scandal in the Muslim community over whether Aisha had cheated on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were dealing with real human conditions. And they had to take the responsibility, and the time and the effort had to be put in to deal with human conditions. So we can't be a virtue police, people. You understand what I'm saying? The first beginning stages of da'wah, people have to be convinced from their hearts. They have to be committed. And then when they commit, you understand what I'm saying, and fully, then you can make some moves. That's why ta'aleem and tarbiyah are so important. That's why we should be focusing on small group building. Because when you try to do this massive, mass da'wah, you're not really hitting people on the individual level. Like what sort of transformation is taking place? How can that work? You understand what I'm saying? To transform people, for them to be in the transformative process themselves. Because we're working together in that. We can't just come in and transform people ourselves. They have to participate in that effort. We're confused in this regard. And that's because people are not trained in education and formation. They're not trained in ta'aleem wa tarbiyah, and they're coming into the community. They are trying to engage in education, and that's not their field. That's not their expertise. That's not their background. That's not their experience. And so they're just throwing around ideas like they're defending the deen. In reality, they're not defending the deen with that, because they're creating complexities. People, I'm not going to mention what sex the person is or what gender the person is, but I had a Muslim come to me that's a professional crying. And that Muslim told me, I struggle with homosexuality. And I'm wondering if Allah has an issue with me or not. And I keep up my salah, and I don't engage in any sort of activity that Islam will consider to be prohibited. But I'm struggling with these issues. And when I deal with the Muslims, they push me away. They push me to deal with the non-Muslims that are talking about these issues, because I have no space. I have no place to be. Don't tell me that I'm justifying anything, people, to be honest with you. I'm talking about one thing as a counselor, somebody coming to you and bringing you a problem and telling you that they're suicidal and they're going through depression. You understand what I'm saying? You have to address that issue as it is. And so we bring these things up on a regular basis. I'm not saying that we're doing that type of work. We can easily be principled and committed to the values of the deen and know how to serve people. That's no different to me than a person that's struggling with an addiction. It's no different to me than a person that's struggling with an anger problem. It's no different to me than a person that's struggling with salah. It's one struggle amongst many. Or a person that's struggling with the whole issue of wanting to get multiple wives. Or a person wanting to stay in a relationship. It's a struggle that a person has. And it's compounded when a person is coming and bringing to you the dynamic and telling you that they're going through suicidal tendencies or ideation and all of that. Come on, people, like, let's be responsible. We can't police virtue. It's not just it's in multiple issues. We can't police virtue. People need to be guided and groomed. But this is why I say that's why I said take this to the president of the masjid. Since he wants to be the leader of the community, it's not the responsibility of the mashaykh and the imams. Take it to the president of the masjid. Let him address these issues. Because you, the Muslim community, decide to have that structure in place. Now take it to the president of the masjid. Y'all put him in charge of the community. Let him deal with these types of problems. Let him resolve that issue. Because an imam and a mashaykh can't deal with these issues unless they're going to deal with them independent of the masjid. Because even me, myself, as a teacher and an educator in the Muslim community, there's times where I can't even teach and educate y'all. Because in the circles that I'm in, y'all even want to tell me how to teach. That's where you're at. So that's why I said take it to whoever claims to be responsible in the leadership. But as far as the society is concerned, people, these changes that you have seen, this is a result of where Christianity has gone. And you have to be patient with that reality because they're dealing with another set of circumstances. And you have to realize that their religious orientation in this society has choked them out. Christianity, what did it mean for the black community in part? What did it mean for the indigenous community, if not their genocide and annihilation? Christianity, what did it mean for science? That's not to say that there's no good principles in Christianity. That's not to say that Christianity didn't bring about good, but we also have to realize what problems Christianity brought. For science, it choked out scientific inquiry. And so for people that sees that their religious beliefs are stopping them from being able to deal with truth, they're going to say, well, scientific truth, there's a contradiction here. It has to be dealt with. So we have to be patient with that regard. You understand what I'm saying? But there's been mistakes that have been made in this society. And there's been forces that have been unleashed on this society which have brought us to this position. That's why we say, when you start talking, when we go to the core and we say, when you start talking about Eurocentricity, when you make Europe, Western Europe in specific, the center of how things are done, when you make white supremacy the support system of that, you understand what I'm saying? When you make those two pillars the foundation of your society, it requires some radical changes so that we can get to the core of why it is that there's breakdowns in society. But when we start talking about virtue, people, it's possible, but it's very difficult to talk about virtue in isolation. In other words, if an individual is virtuous, how do we know that you're virtuous? We have to see your virtue in relation to society. But this society, it has made morality and spirituality private, a thing of the heart. And that's why the law comes in to tell you what you do and what you can't do. So the law is not claiming to be religious, but the law is claiming to set the record straight on how things should go. So when that law changes, it may be the case that morality changes, and that's what you're dealing with. That the law has changed in regards to certain things that were considered virtuous before, or some things that were considered vices before. It has changed. You have to understand that in your mind as a Muslim so you're clear. Because your position is one of dawah, and you have to realize that you're in a set of circumstances which are complicated because of those problems. You're dealing with a community that has internally gone through so many transformations, and itself in many ways is confused. Western society is confused. They have some things that are right, And that's because of the ability of exploiting other people and getting resources to be able to kind of work through it. You understand what I'm saying? And there's certain things that they have gotten right from experience, right? And there's certain things that they need to be recognized on, but there's a lot of problems in this society, in these societies as a whole. You know, the problems are a consequence of where the history was at. And so I don't understand why our Mashaykh can't have those types of dialogues. I don't understand why our community can't come to that understanding that this is a work in progress. And so that's why you have to have an understanding of where you stand as a Muslim in the contemporary world. That traditionalism is not going to help you with that. Throwing around a bunch of dhikr beads, you understand what I'm saying? And talk about my sheikh and having a certain type of kufi and, you know, a certain type of beard, you know, and talking a certain way and talk about following a madhab and tasawwuf is not going to help you with that. Declaring yourself Salafi is not going to help you with that. You understand what I'm saying? It hasn't worked in that regard. There's some things that we need to address with regard to us living in the contemporary world that is possible to draw from those orientations, but we have to do that work. We have to do that work. But traditionalism and Salafism or even Islamism or all of these isms as ideologies without dealing with the contemporary world today, you can't just say, well, we're going to solve all issues if Khilafah is restored, all our problems are solved. You're still going to be dealing with human beings. That's not the prophetic reality. The prophetic reality is that political change was being instituted, but it was also accompanied by personal communal change. And it's not an issue that we have to wait till we're perfect before we start launching, you know, a program of change at the communal and social levels. No, we have experiences like Shaykh Uthman bin Fodi, rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatin wasi'a. He taught us that reality. You can be in the motion initiating change. As a matter of fact, our involvement pushes us to be better people when you have the right guidance, because then you're clear that, look, you know, we have to correct ourselves. If you look at some of the revolutionary leadership and movements, they have said the same thing, that you need some sort of spiritual base. You need to work on yourself. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's a radical like Don Freeman, you know, or others. You understand what I'm saying? Or others, you know, that have, you know, been at the forefront. And so when you look at the reality at the end of the day, I'm having a blockage right now because I want to say, you know, she for whatever reason she's reminding me of Aretha, but I'm thinking of the she right now she's popular, she was said to be part of the Black Panther Party, but my mind, I'm having a blockage, and hold on one second. I have to get the assistance of technology. I don't know why my mind is just shutting down. Angela Davis. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous how my mind is that's because I have so much stuff going on. Simple stuff that I'm clear on, it becomes stuff that I'm blocked on. But you know, Angela Davis mentioned the same reality as well as Don Freeman. You know, that you have to prepare yourself, and that's what, you know, and the Muslim community critique of some of the activists is very legit from the Muslim community because they're not properly prepared. But at the same time, the activist critique of the Muslim community has some weight too, that the Muslim community itself is not properly prepared because it lacks engagement. It lacks actual engagement. You understand what I'm saying? So let's not trade in Islam for white conservatism, people. Because some of our imams and mashaykh and others and talking heads and leadership in the Muslim community, they're pushing white conservatism as deen. And I'm like, hold on a second. No. You understand what I'm saying? Like, you don't get to push white conservatism, you know what I'm saying, if it's having a direct impact negatively on others. If that was your orientation, it didn't harm others, then that's on you, in the fact that you chose to build your Islamic orientation in that way, right? But that's something that we really need to recognize. From the maqasid, or the principles of the Sharia, that's non-viable, meaning we can't violate it, is the preservation of human dignity, regardless of who that human being is. The Quran tells us, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. And when we start talking about the objectives of the Sharia, we say are supported by so many evidences that it reaches the level of what we call qawati' or qat'i, is absolute. So no one has an individual opinion on that the Islam teaches preservation and cultivation of human dignity. We're never going to get anywhere in a da'wah if we're in the hadith of the man who killed 99 men, if we're just religious bigots. So when people come to you and they're asking for your support and your help, you tell them, no, you're not worthy. No, you're not worthy. The gates are closed to you. You don't give them any sort of approach to orient themselves. You don't talk to them about the guidance of Allah. You just condemn them to hell. The other day, there was a brother telling people that they were in the hellfire. And I had to show to him where the ulama have said that this is not a correct position. You can't claim anyone is in the hellfire except in some general way, but you can't claim individuals are in the hellfire without proof as specifying that. It's a violation of principles of the deen in that regard, to talk in this manner. But we ourselves that are in the position of talking about Islam and servicing the community, we ourselves have to be careful, right? That we're not, pushing people over the edge so that they're suicidal and they're homicidal and they are destructive and they are at a point where they self-implode, because people are struggling in today's time. And it could come by intolerant teachings. Intolerant teachings doesn't mean that we accept violations of the deen. I'm talking about the way that we treat. Listen carefully, the way we treat people. I have a talk that's coming up after a little bit after I do this errand that I have to do, and it's going to talk about communication on two levels. That how we mess out the affective level, which is we talk about emotion and sensibility, and the other level is rational. When we start talking about ideas and communicating at that level, and how we missed the point on these two fronts, right? And so one thing that we can borrow from the Greeks, which is they weren't the only ones, they borrowed this from the ancient Egyptians. But communication or rhetoric, we could talk about ethos, which is the ethical right or wrong part of life when we talk about right or wrong. We can talk about pathos, which we're talking about the emotive part, right? And we could talk about logos, right, as well, right? Those are, and logos is that rational part, right, where we're communicating, on all of those levels. And there's others. I want to pause there, but there's other levels of communication, but these are important, parts to communicate. And then the issue of aesthetics, the issue of capturing beauty. You understand what I'm saying? When you capture beauty. And so that's extremely important. You know what I'm saying? When you start talking about the issue of aesthetics, because you're appealing to multiple levels of the human being, and that's just good rhetoric. That's also, and when we start studying Arabic rhetoric, that's also, the levels that we find in the way the Arabic language has been studied and structured, that you're communicating to people on multiple levels. But when you're trying to talk about ethos only, and you're not addressing how they feel about things, or you're not appealing to them on multiple other levels so that they get a sense of meaning, you're not connecting with them. And so I want to talk about that, but just focus on the issue of the effective and the the rational side of communication, because I think that will be beneficial. And so it'll serve as a point of continuity between this live and what comes next. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.